thanks y'all about this. For attending this. I am so grateful that you're here for our 10th ever conference. I wish that we could be in person, but this will have to do. And pretty neat. This is our 10th ever conference here at Rehumanize International. Perhaps more specifically, though, I think I really need to be thankful that you've chosen to dive into this topic, which honestly is practically a science fiction turned science fact. It's kind of weird to think about the fact that even 200 years ago, this whole topic wouldn't even have been something that we would have talked about. So I'm going to, let me see, share my slides here. Let me know if you can see them. Yes, you can see them. Great, excellent. Like 200 years ago, there was just practically no knowledge of this subject whatsoever. The science of the embryo was practically unknown. Kind of weird. Heck, the scientific field didn't even learn about the existence of the mammalian ovum until 1827. And the first real understanding of sperm egg fusion or fertilization, giving rise to a new embryo, wasn't understood until Oscar Hartwig recorded watching sea urchin gametes complete the process during the 1870s. Technology and scientific knowledge developed, and about 100 years later, in 1978, the world's first baby ever conceived using IVF was born. Regretfully, ever since then, our world has been more or less ignoring many of the moral questions that follow. To echo the brilliant fictional Dr. Ian Malcolm, played by Pittsburgh native, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Today, the shockingly unregulated fertility industry in the United States can often create somewhere around 10 to 20 embryos per client going through IVF, way more than an average family would ever desire to carry to term or parent. According to even the most conservative estimates, there are more than 400,000 of these tiny human beings being treated as leftovers, as if there ever could be leftover humans. Essentially, they're held incarcerated, where they're also vulnerable to being used for parts in embryonic stem cell research. These embryos are being artificially orphaned. They haven't lost their parents, but the fertility industry, by being irresponsible in how many embryos they create, are essentially creating orphanages in their storage freezers. Our stance at Rehumanize International is one that echoes the great human rights activists of the world. Each and every human being is equally deserving of human rights. We reject the idea that any circumstance like age, ability, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, location, nationality, ethnicity, immigration situation, condition of dependence, or socioeconomic status could ever change the inherent dignity and worth that we all share, or the foundational rights that we deserve. As you just learned in Dr. Kondick's brilliant presentation during the last session, human embryos are, by every scientific measure, human beings, living, whole for their stage of development, unique and unrepeatable members of the human species. Thus, even the tiniest and most dependent member of our human family, our embryonic siblings, deserves to have these human rights respected and protected. The first human right that I'll discuss today is the most fundamental and foundational, the right to live free from aggressive violence. Without that right protected, we truly have no security in any other rights. If we could be killed or harmed with no regard for our dignity, with impunity, and with no consequences for those participating in our death, then no other rights of ours really matter. If I have a supposed right to food or healthcare or housing, but my right to live free from intentional harm isn't first protected and upheld, then those other rights are meaningless. Because of course, if I'm dead, then I can't eat, and my health is non-existent, and my need for shelter is nil. It's a very straightforward fact. You can't exercise rights or take advantage of any privileges if you're dead. So as the first and foremost human right, we all share in this equally. The right to not be intentionally harmed, destroyed, or otherwise subject to violence, embryonic humans included. And what that means is that intentionally destroying embryos, whether through using their bodies for science and embryonic stem cell research, or by proactively letting them expire and therefore intentionally starving and suffocating them, is an act of aggressive violence and is therefore illicit. So when we hear of hundreds of thousands of tiny human embryos being argued over about whether it's okay to obliterate them via embryonic stem cell research or letting them expire, we must work to end that violation of human rights and dignity. The second human right that I'll review is one that has become fairly solidified in the global culture, but only in the last 300 years: the right to not be treated as property. As we all know, the practice of chattel slavery treated humans as property with no other rights. But as human beings, as living members of a species with rationality, we all deserve to be treated as ends in ourselves, not as mere means to an end. I'd argue that being treated as property is a form of aggressive violence and harm, precisely because it denies the self-ownership all humans have over themselves and treats humans not as ends in themselves, but rather as a mere means to an end. I want to mention it separately from the right to live free from aggressive violence, though, because I think it's a form of harm that can be specifically overlooked in the oft-heated discussion of embryonic humans. Unfortunately, embryonic humans are legally treated as property, and even embryo adoption treats them not as the invaluable and unique children that they are, but rather as clumps of cells or as products to be donated and transferred to their adoptive parents, or from their placing parents. Granted, the embryo adoption agency that we're working with, Snowflakes, uses the constructs that have been implemented for infant adoption as much as possible. But because the US doesn't recognize human embryos as human beings, one of the contracts that still must be included in the process of embryo adoption is the contract that's a transfer of property. I tend to think that the larger problem is related to two main cultural issues. The fact that in our culture, children are still in many ways treated as property of their parents, and the fact that the legality and social reliance upon abortion rests upon the status of embryos and fetuses as non-humans or non-persons. Nonetheless, this current legal situation violates the dignity of these embryonic children, and it must be ameliorated. So when we hear of millions of these embryonic children being treated as property, as goods to be created, edited, bought, sold, donated, and transferred as mere medical products, we must work to end that violation of human rights and dignity. The next human right that I'll cover is the right to not be held in indefinite detention. Without that right protected, any entity more powerful than another could incarcerate the weaker one. An individual could do it, a state too, or even a corporation. Like the right to not be treated as property, I think that this right does fall under the general umbrella of the right to live free from violence, because indefinite detention is a harm to the individual and their dignity. Whatever our age, ability, or innocent or guilty status, being imprisoned without recourse to a trial, especially without knowing that when freedom may come, if ever, it's akin to torture. We see support of this right, of course, in the work that many human rights activists have done and continue to do in support of immigrants and refugees in recent years, who have been held in indefinite detention, essentially in concentration camps around the nation. And granted, I know that Pedro is talking about this subject right now in his session that's happening at the same time. But I think it's important to point out this right has been highlighted even recently. Because if we don't have the right to live free from such a torturous incarceration, then we cannot really experience the full freedom that's accorded to our human dignity. And for these tiny embryos that are held in cryopreservation, they cannot experience the full breadth and depth of their human life. As they're held there, they do not have the chance to grow, to experience life, to feel the love of a family, or do so many of the things that we have been able to do in the course of our own lives. Honestly, it's something out of a dystopian comic book story. Humans held in freezers by a reckless industry, unable to live their lives. So when we hear of 400,000 tiny embryonic humans being held indefinitely, incarcerated in ice-cold freezers, we must work to end that violation of human rights and dignity. The final rights that I'll go over in this session will be the rights to nutrition, shelter, and family. By nutrition, I mean the means of gaining energy to metabolize and continue to live. For most of us attending the conference right now, that will likely mean regular access to food, water, and clean air. For disabled people, that might mean getting nutrition through a feeding tube and oxygen through a respirator. But for all of us, during the earliest phases of our life, the natural and normal way that we would receive nutrition while we were in the womb was through the uterine lining, the placenta, and the umbilical cord. And by shelter, I mean a place to live, typically that would protect us from exposure to harm or the elements that could injure us. For many of us, that's would likely mean something like an apartment, an RV, or a house. For astronauts, that might mean a shuttle or a space station or their spacesuit. But for all of us, during the earliest phases of our lives, the natural and normal way that we would receive shelter would be within the safety of the womb, where it was safe for us and we could receive nutrition. And by family, I mean the unit of community that lives with us, that raises us and helps us to grow and thrive with love and care. For many of us in the US, that likely means our genetic parents, perhaps some genetically related siblings, and maybe a grandparent or two. For many queer folks like myself, that might mean found or chosen family, and other friends and foster kids. And for kids who were tragically orphaned or placed in state custody, it could include foster or adoptive parents, extended family, and friends. But regardless of how our family structure looks, all of us, and particularly children, deserve to receive love and care in the context of a family. And for all of us, when we were embryos, we require this particular love and care from our families through nutrition and shelter within the womb. One of the things that I want to emphasize here is that the form of nutrition, shelter, and family care, the form that it takes for embryos, looks different than what we as infants, teens, adults, or elders might require. But our varying circumstances of age, ability, location, and dependence don't impact our worth and whether we still deserve these basic human rights. The nutrition, shelter, and family care that we deserve or the nutrition, family care, and shelter that embryos require within the womb is perfectly understandable, natural, and normal for their state in life. It isn't an extraordinary demand to say that they deserve this care, even if it is more difficult for us as adults to provide that care than it might be to feed, water, shelter, and clothe a toddler. When we review all of these rights, at odds with the injustice of 400,000 embryos stuck in freezers and more being created every day, and by the way, that's just in the United States, some things become clear, I think. Number one, perpetuating the reckless, unfettered fertility industry status quo is unacceptable and unsustainable. Beyond the issue of hundreds of thousands of excess embryos created for this greedy industry, there are many issues involved with regard to the ethics of donor conception, infamous predatory physicians, and the widespread practice of selective reduction, or AKA abortion, when there are too many fetuses growing after an IVF cycle. This industry must be highly regulated or abolished. At the least, all embryos created should be required to be implanted by the couple paying for their creation. Number two, Destruction of embryos held in storage is not an ethical option, up to and including embryonic stem cell research. The science industry may try to assuage the consciences of parents who have had too many embryos created during IVF by offering to take the donation of their embryos for the good of scientific research. But this practice must be ended because it treats these children as a means to an end. And all embryos frozen in storage must be given a chance at life. Number 3, an appropriate response to these embryos in need of nutrition, shelter, and care within a family is to open our hearts, our bodies, and homes to them in a spirit of radical hospitality. Though the best case scenario would involve no embryos ever being left behind by the families who created them, in the situation that we have today, where there are hundreds of thousands of them stuck in freezers, I think us pro-life people must be challenged by their existence, that we must be compelled and motivated into action. Hospitality must be a hallmark of a culture of life. For when we see the inherent dignity in the other, who's in need of nutrition, shelter, and family, I think it would reek of indifference, hatred, or cruelty to disregard those needs. So whether it means pursuing embryo adoption yourself or promoting it in our circles and helping fund the adoptions of friends and family who are pursuing it, I encourage you to engage in some radical hospitality to the tiniest and least of our human siblings. If you're balking at this proposition, particularly those Catholics in the audience who might have heard the discourse, with a capital D, from some Catholic moral theologians, I invite you to consider this. What are the alternatives? Of course, we can't destroy the embryos to do away with the so-called problem of their existence. Firstly, I think it's a yikes to call any human's existence a problem. But secondly, killing someone to use their body parts or starving them to death because how they were created is morally objectionable to you isn't a viable solution either. Violence like this violates human dignity. It is contrary to human rights. But neither can we let these tiny humans languish in these freezers forever just because we don't want to participate in the IVF industry. Indefinite detention violates human dignity. It is contrary to human rights. And how someone was conceived doesn't change this principle. You might be hearing in my response here an underlying point that I've been trying to sort of skirt throughout this talk. Our manner of conception doesn't impact the inherent dignity that we all share, nor does it impact the rights that we are entitled to as members of the human species. For those who are uncomfortable with the IVF industry, as I might be, I'd encourage you to pose yourself this little thought experiment. Would you be opposed to adopting a child because they were conceived out of wedlock? What if they were conceived in a violent rape? You might roll your eyes or laugh at my question, but such children were once considered less human or less worthy of rights in many cultures. The central point here is how a child was conceived impacts in no way their dignity and rights. It might convey some message about the morality or the choices of one or both of their parents, but it says nothing about the child themselves. Any living child deserves to live free from aggressive violence, to not be treated as property, to not be held in indefinite detention, and to have nutrition, shelter, and family. If we truly believe that the life of every human being begins at conception, and that life and the dignity of every human being matters, then we must stand behind the rights of these embryonic children and support their right to all these things. And I think that means we have to support their right to be transferred to the womb, the natural place for them to receive such care at that stage of their life. And as much as possible, to allow them to be cared for by and integrated or adopted into a family who loves them for the duration of their natural lives. Maybe you're coming more around at this point, but perhaps there are other objections to embryo adoption that you've heard, like, well, you should take care of the children that are already here, or the world is overpopulated as it is. We don't need any more humans. To both of these, I'd respond, I think there might be a misunderstanding because according to all scientific measures, these embryos are human children who are already here. They're just tiny and being held in indefinite detention in freezers in need of care and protection. We have a responsibility to them as fellow human beings. So up to this point, you've heard much of the ethical rigmarole that's been sloshing around my brain for the last decade or so. It's probably fairly easy to see how I, as a passionately pro-life person, became convinced of the importance of embryo rights, and particularly of the need to support embryo adoption. But perhaps you're wondering how I determined that this is a path that I needed to take. It's a fun but fairly straightforward story, looking back at it now. I was interested in embryo adoption since I first heard about it as a 16-year-old, just getting active in pro-life work. But it slipped to the back burner of my mind for many years as I pursued a college degree and all that. So imagine me at 21, queer, Catholic, Latina, burgeoning human rights activist, full-time college student in ethics, history, and public policy, and part-time quirky girl and fashionista. I met this guy named Kyle, though truth be told, neither of us remembers meeting the other. This was not a love at first sight kind of deal. And shortly thereafter, I found this framed certificate at a thrift store. The certificate was from some heraldic name registry with Murphy on it. Thinking that was funny, I spent the 50 cents to buy it and gave it to Kyle and his brother as a silly gag gift. The certificate included the Murphy crest and family motto, which was brave and hospitable. Kyle chortled and put it up in the entryway of the house that he shared with his brother and some other friends. Shortly thereafter, we danced at a friend's wedding. That's the first picture there on the left. And then we started going on dates. And we grew in trust to love one another. After a year of dating, we were engaged. And after a year of engagement and me starting a little side project called Life Matters Journal, which is now Rehumanize International, we were married. That's the second picture there. We planned to have a big family. I wanted 10 kids. I had literally had first and middle names picked out for both boys and girls. Our hearts were open and full of expectation. We hoped to welcome many children into our family with ease and delight. Alas, an easy path to building family was not in the cards for us. Infertility struck us hard and fast. After just 8 months of marriage and trying to conceive, we learned that we were infertile. That kind of wrecked us, to be honest. We tried visiting various doctors and got poked and prodded and tested more than most people do in their lifetimes. During the early years of our marriage, we wrestled with faith and unbelief, with hope and despair, with courage and apathy. But our love stayed true. After years of trying the few medical interventions that we could afford, we eventually put a pause on trying to conceive at all. It was so draining to go through the cycle of hope and despair over and over and over again. So we stopped and discerned and prayed about what was next for us. We still had that silly little 50-cent heraldic name registry certificate framed in our house. And we felt drawn to the motto, brave and hospitable. We knew that even if we couldn't have children the normal way, that we were still called to radical hospitality, to open our hearts and our home to those who need it as much as we are able. Over the years, we've opened our doors to dozens of young adults as they were finding their footing in the world. More than just a place to lay their heads, we also hope to be family to them, to be authentic witnesses to love, and to create a safe space for them to unfold. Though it's been sometimes challenging, it's also been a true gift. To this day, we are doing the work of building found family with our sweet housemates, Marianne and Sarah. Sarah's working here behind the scenes today. Together, we all hope to continue this work of radical hospitality for the rest of our lives, including through foster care and adoption. So this all brings us to today. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, the last picture there on the right is Marianne, Sarah, me, and our dog Domino, and Kyle. So this brings us to today. After years of prayer and discernment, we heard loud and clear the call to be hospitable to embryonic children. Though we know we can't save all of the embryos that are in storage, we want to do what we can to give a family an opportunity at life to some of these children who are currently stuck on ice. We have to do what we can with what we have. We believe that this is part of the radical hospitality that we've been called to in our life. As I've mentioned before, it's something that had even been on my heart before we married because of my own work for human dignity and prenatal rights. So we've told our adoption agency that we'd like to adopt 6 or more embryos with the hopes that with our love, support, and care, that they'll all make it to full term and birth and live happy, healthy, and long lives. Now, you might be wondering more about the process of embryo adoption. What's it been like so far for us as a prospecting adoptive family? We're still in the early stages of the process, but I'd be happy to share with you what we've learned so far from our agency. And of course, the timeline that I'll share here is going to be entirely based on our experience with one particular agency, Snowflakes Embryo Adoption, which is a project of Nightlight Christian Adoptions. We've selected them as our adoption agency really because they did seem to emphasize the dignity and rights of the embryonic children as paramount. And so far, they've been pretty excellent to work with. The first step for us was talking about it with our health insurance and healthcare providers. We wanted to know how much they cover of the process and which physicians to get connected with. Since then, there's been some consults, hormone tests, and other reproductive function evaluations. We first wanted to ensure that I could hypothetically carry a pregnancy to term without any contraindications. Next, we contacted Snowflakes to do an intro call and learn more about the process. We were assigned a team member to contact if we had any questions and then filled out a questionnaire about our interest. We learned during this step that the average Snowflakes adoption costs the adopting couple about $10,000 to $12,000. Not including the medical expenses that come with fertility testing, medications, the frozen embryo transfer, or birth. So we started brainstorming ways to crowdfund that very large amount during the next phase as well. The next step is the application, which for Snowflakes involves a fee of $500 or so, where you have to submit your basic demographic information, facts about where you live, who you live with, health info, and submit a form from an OB-GYN indicating that there are no contraindications to pregnancy. The application also included questions to understand if we had any desires or preferences about our adopted children. We reject a consumerist mindset or the idea of getting a child for ourselves. We're doing this to provide a home and care and a family to a child or children who are in need of those things. So we indicated that we have no preferences about race, disability, or donor conception. We're just doing our best to be open to life, to the children who come our way, who need a home. Our one preference that we did mark was not about the children at all, but about the level of contact with the genetic families. We want our adoption to be as open as possible, particularly because we recognize that whichever children we adopt will likely want to know about their family of origin at some point or another, and may want to have relationships with their siblings or genetic parents. We also indicated that we'd be open to adopting embryos from multiple placing families, because in the end, we know that it's about saving lives, not creating a matching set. After we finished the application and submitted it, we opened our online crowdfunding page to invite our community to support us financially in this effort. After application comes the family evaluation or home study portion, which includes learning modules, required reading, FBI and child abuse background checks, writing a family profile, a physical exam by a physician, lots of forms, and of course, a home visit by a social worker. For us, since we have some chosen family housemates, this step might take a bit longer than it would for the average family going through embryo adoption. Right now, we're still in this stage of the process for the family evaluation, and we anticipate that we'll probably be in it for another month or so, but we're doing the best we can given our circumstances to get through it fast. Next, the matching phase could take anywhere from 1 month to 6. During this phase, Snowflakes will use the information that we've submitted so far about any preferences alongside our written family profile to try to match us with a placing family. Once a match has been approved by all parties, then I believe some correspondence can be exchanged, and then there's contract signing for the adoption to be finalized. Once the adoption has been finalized, we'll have custody of the embryos, and they will make a somewhat treacherous journey from whichever freezer they've been stored in to our medical facility here in Pittsburgh. Next, because Nightlight has some stipulations that they've developed, we'll begin the process of FET, or frozen embryo transfer, where one embryo can be thawed and transferred at a time. The FET will require me to be on a hormone medication to make my uterine lining ultra thick. Then an embryo will be placed in my uterus, and we'll cross our fingers in the hopes that the itty bitty human will be sticky. And with the medical help that my doctors can provide, can make it to birth and live a long and healthy life. If they do make it to birth, their birth certificate will only list my husband and I as the child's parents, which I have complicated feelings about. The situation certainly implies that it will be our responsibility to maintain a relationship with any child's genetic parents who place them for adoption. But I'm positive that being open about how we came to be the child's parents will be an aspect of their life that we won't really ever hide. As I embark upon this journey, I'm honestly so excited for what lies ahead. And even though the road has been painful to weather at times, I'm so grateful that life has led us here. Who would have thought that a 50-cent thrift store joke would have ended up being so influential? So here I'll just leave you with a call to curiosity and a hope for the future. May we ask ourselves regularly, what is our responsibility to these embryonic siblings? And let's think about if we have the courage to love them and protect them as they deserve. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope you'll ask yourself how you can extend radical hospitality to these tiniest members of our human family. I believe we still have a few minutes left, so I can probably take one question at this time. Also, if you want to contact me on social media or email, my contact info is there on the last slide. Okay, let me see. There's so many questions in the Q&A and in the chat. Does your adoption agency refuse to let non-Christians adopt? I believe Kyle answered this question. I think Nightlight does allow non-Christians to adopt, and I think even like they're totally open with having single people or queer people adopt too. It hasn't been a problem that's come up. Okay. I have a different question about ethics with the industry and embryo adoption. If adopting from them gives them more money, does this not raise the danger of the industry being given more money and thus potentially lead to its expansion, thereby being long-term counterproductive at saving lives? I'm concerned that it's analogous to paying a ransom to terrorists or perhaps adopting from a kill shelter and then giving them more money to expand their operations. I'd be curious to hear Aimee's response. Thank you, Anonymous. Great question. So the embryo adoption itself, I actually don't think gives money to the part of the fertility industry that's responsible for the creation of these embryos. I believe like we will have to pay a storage fee, like a cryopreservation fee, for the duration of time that it will take to, like attempt implantation for all of the embryos. But the payment that we give goes to our adoption agency, which is very specifically like dedicated to upholding the dignity of these embryos. And I actually just read the book, A Snowflake Named Hannah, and they seem to have a substantial interest in ending the processes that would result in so many excess embryos. Based on some of the material that I've read in that book, it seems like they understand that these embryos have human rights and have human dignity, and that creating them like in excess is really problematic. So I think that's kind of neat. As far as like, is it like giving a ransom? Kind of. I mean, actually, like, if I'm going to be totally honest with you right now, I'm going to divulge one of my personal gut feelings about this, because I already have one boy name picked out, and it's a middle name, but the name is Ransom. And I have a friend who entered the Order of Mercedarians, which is a Catholic religious order that's existed for centuries. And basically their whole charism was paying ransoms for captives, for people who were stuck in slavery, for people who were stuck in trafficking, paying their slave fee, their head fee, their ransom to get them out of captivity and free them. And this was something that was generally lauded by the church, like even though it was giving money to people who were doing bad things, that the freedom of that individual was worth more than the money that they would give. So I think, especially as someone who is working to end this practice in the IVF industry, and like it's something that I want to spend more time on, I don't feel morally conflicted about it because I'm doing what I can with what I have. And I am only one person, and the best that I can do is save the lives of the children who are really in need right now. Okay, I have time for maybe one more question. So I'm going to try to get through one more. But if you want to talk to me, feel free to message me on social media or send me an email, and I would love to chat. I will also be in the expo booth later. There are efforts to regulate the fertility industry in the US. They're not super centralized right now. And that's something that I wish would happen, and maybe I'll be part of it. So stay tuned. For anyone interested in embryo adoption or considering it for the first time, what factors should the person think about in choosing an adoption agency or ART treatments, et cetera? If you're choosing ART treatments, the one thing I would say is top of mind should be the dignity of the human person. And it's why I'm not comfortable with IVF in the first place, because I'm not comfortable with treating humans as a good to be created and procured and edited for my desires. That's not a general rule amongst, pro-lifers. It's not a general rule amongst even our team at Rehumanize. There are people with different perspectives. The thing that we all agree on is that the destruction of embryos is the thing that is, the most morally objectionable, and it's what we're working together to end. So I would hope that if you're choosing an agency for embryo adoption, that you look for one that is really highlighting the dignity of these embryos and their right to a family, their right to live. That's been the most important thing for us. I think at this point we are technically at the end of time, but I will answer one more question if I can. Okay. How can we get pro-lifers to stop turning to the IVF industry for children when it discards or freezes them? I think education on this matter, and really like calling people to be better, calling people up, calling people in, with the understanding that, if they are going to pursue IVF, that they need to talk with their doctor, whatever scientists are going to be working with them, and tell them, like, we only want you to create 3 embryos because that's as many as we would be comfortable parenting. And make sure that you don't have the situation of excess embryos being created. But if we're trying to turn people away from IVF in the first place, I would say that we should really highlight the fact that IVF does contribute to a cultural commoditization of children. That it really does treat them as a product. And, even though we are doing embryo adoption, and we recognize begrudgingly that the current contract situation doesn't treat the children as full human persons, we are working towards that end. And to just participate in the industry blindly, and especially like to give money to facilities and this industry that is so recklessly treating human beings, I think should really give us pause. So I'm sure I didn't fully answer all of these questions. Honestly, I feel like I could talk about this for days. So if you want to chat with me in the expo booth or on social media or whatever, get in touch with me there.